A few days ago, the Senate Democrats caved to the Republicans over the government shutdown. You watch the whole thing, speeches, stern condemnations, the cringeworthy TikTok posts, the insistence that this time, the line would be held. Look, I'm using profanity, I must be serious. And then, at the critical moment, when it counted, the inevitable, the familiar surrender. If you felt bewildered by that, even bereft watching the surrender culture that defines the opposition or what passes for an opposition, you're not wrong. You're watching a structural problem play out in real time. Nothing to do with political courage. Everything to do with political physics. Hey folks, I'm Todd Sturmer. I'm an American scholar of resistance history at the University of Southern Denmark and the author of A Resistance History of the United States. Really, it's done. I can finally read emails and DMs again. Not that I'm going to, but I can. Let's talk about the pathology of political surrender. To start simple, establishment leaders care more about holding their position than performing their role, than doing their job. Let's call it Sturmer's first law of establishment douchebags. People in positions of authority want, first and foremost, to remain in positions of authority. What presidents and members of Congress want more than anything else? The next term. They're more interested in keeping their job than in doing their job. And then, they're the only viable alternative to the far right, which means zero reason to change, no incentive. Why risk that stability, the invitations to all of the parties, the speaking gigs, all of the projected deference with an actual positive message, like, I don't know, universal health care, when that could lose a Reagan Democrat somewhere that doesn't exist anymore, or some white kid listening to a broke podcast, when at least we're not as bad as the other guy, works perfectly fine for them. It's a unifying message. They take their base for granted. Where else are you going to go? They antagonize potential allies on the left. Where else are they going to go? And they exploit this by performing opposition, talking a good game while never threatening established power. Talk opposition, act establishment. And this manufactures the fiction, yes, the fiction, that you have no legitimate option, that you have nowhere else to go. And that fiction runs on an ideology. And you see it and hear it everywhere, particularly when you start to identify it. In the Atlantic, in the New York Times, to your most earnest leftish friends who still believe the system works. Why do they think there is nowhere else for you to go? Liberal nationalism. Conservative nationalism, you know, that's the easy one. Flags everywhere, America first, reverence for military and police, explicit hierarchies about who counts as a real American. It's exclusionary. It's nostalgic for a past that mostly sucked for most people. It openly defends traditional power structures that reinforce their tenuous claims to authority. But the message is clear. Some people belong, some don't, and the institutions exist to enforce that order. Liberal nationalism is sneakier because it sounds progressive. It's the language of the New York Times editorial board and Ken Burns and Aaron Sorkin, your high school civics teacher explaining checks and balances like they're receiving wisdom from God. Even Jon Stewart a bit too often. It sounds like it's about justice and progress and making things better and reclaiming the flag. But here's what liberal nationalism actually says. American institutions are fundamentally legitimate and good even when they demonstrably fail or enforce injustice. It's the belief that the Constitution is sacred, that the founders were wise, that the system they created, if we just work within it properly, will eventually deliver justice. Let's be happy warriors. It treats procedural norms as more important than substantive outcomes, defends institutions even when those institutions enforce evil, and it treats anyone challenging the system as the real problem, not the abuse of power they're challenging. Liberal nationalism and conservative nationalism share the same goal. Both exist to protect the establishment. Both insist the institutions are legitimate and must be preserved. The difference is just, aesthetic. Conservative nationalism is explicit about hierarchy and exclusion, while liberal nationalism wraps the same institutional protection in the language of process and progress and patriotism, and eventually getting there if we're all just patient. We might not win, but boy, we should deserve it. And in the end, my Thomas Jefferson quote is more powerful than your Thomas Jefferson quote. Liberal nationalism tells you Trump is a threat to democracy, then insists we can't do anything about it, like pack the courts, or abolish the Electoral College, or restructure the Senate, or restructure congressional rules, because that would violate norms. It condemns police violence and demands we respect law enforcement institutions. It acknowledges the founders were enslavers and then insists we must revere the system they built because, after all, they felt bad about being enslavers, and so therefore we should still use their words to defend ourselves today because, I don't know, magic parchment. It performs opposition while enforcing the boundaries that make real structural change impossible. And the ideology works as what I call an interruption point in opposition, in resistance. First, sacralization. It makes the founders and Constitution sacred. It treats challenging them as heresy, as fundamentally un-American. And second, criminalization. When opposition leaders must move outside of these sanctioned legal channels, their actions get framed as betraying the nation itself. Not betraying people who are getting hurt, betraying the nation, the abstract idea, the flag, the founder's memory, whatever. And the result? Establishment opposition can't escalate the fight. The prisoners of the fiction that their only duty is preserving the institutions, protecting the positions they hold. They can't risk crossing the line because it would destroy the fragile nationalist mythology their power depends on. Better to surrender than threaten the system itself. Which brings us to the deeply weird thing about all this. It is an un-American way of defiance. If you know our resistance history, our actual resistance history, not the sanitized stuff you get in the movies, this surrender culture is profoundly un-American. It asks you to accept being the noble loser, to think obedience to a broken system beats righteous defiance. It demands you forget the Americans who looked at surrender culture and said, no, every day I surrender is a day I'm saying yes to the abuse, that I enable it. They didn't ask why things were as they were. They looked at a system enforcing injustice every day and said, why not break it? What do we have to lose? How bad can things get? Samuel Adams didn't accept abusive authority in Massachusetts in 1775. Adams was a master of provocation and narrative control who understood something crucial. You don't just oppose power, you make it impossible for power to function. He built the infrastructure, committees of correspondence that could mobilize ordinary people across colonies, created the networks that made British authority untenable by making resistance the constant issue. Every British action forced a reaction. Every reaction proved the system is illegitimate. He taught that organized opposition could force the system to retreat, not by asking nicely, but by making the cost of enforcement unbearable. He understood that authority is only as strong as people's willingness to recognize it. He saw an opportunity with nervous men and guns and sent Crispus Attucks into a cold Boston night. Going back a little further, Giles Corey didn't accept abusive Puritan authority in Salem in 1692. When the court demanded he enter a plea, he understood what that meant. Speaking would validate their authority, would make him complicit in their lies about witches and devils and spectral evidence and whatever else they needed to seize people's property. So he refused to speak at all, refused to participate in the performance. And they pressed him under stones, trying to force him to talk, and he kept demanding more weight rather than give them what they wanted. He chose death over complicity, and in doing so, he denied them the legitimacy they needed. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to play the game by their rules. Black loyalists in the American Revolution didn't accept the abusive Southern Patriot Authority in Virginia in 1781, their exclusive form of Patriot Republicanism. Women like Nancy Dixon looked at the Founding Fathers' vision of liberty, which explicitly required her bondage, which was built on her bondage and the bondage of her toddler forever, and practiced what I call strategic pragmatism. She leveraged the British, her enemy's enemy, to seize her own freedom. Understood that you trust interests, not intention. The British needed bodies, she needed freedom, the transaction was clear. Her loyalty was to her personhood and to her child, not to someone else's revolutionary vision that had no room for her. She understood that the enemy of your enemy isn't your friend, but they might be your tool. Use what works. Ona Judge didn't accept George Washington's authority. Think about that for a second. George Washington, the most powerful man in the First Republic, a legend in his own mind, spent decades trying to get her back. He used every legal and illegal method available, and she evaded him and Martha's heirs for 50 years. Made resistance her entire life. Because true resistance isn't one dramatic moment where you give a stirring speech. It's mostly endurance and resilience against the full force of the state bearing down on you year after year and refusing to break. It's waking up every day and choosing not to go back. Henry David Thoreau looked at a state fighting a war to expand slavery, using his tax money to do it. He said, "The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think right." That is a majority of one. He provided the ideological blueprint for refusal, the ideological origin of American resistance. Ideas matter, words matter, and if injustice requires you to be an agent of injustice, you must break the law. Not because breaking the law is inherently good, but because complicity is worse. He understood that sometimes the most moral thing you can do is wash your hands of the whole system. First, take your foot off of the throat of the oppressed. Refuse to participate and make them do it without you. But you gotta make them. The Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, Robert Morris, thousands of others whose names we don't know and never will, didn't ask permission from anybody. They built an unbreakable chain of sophisticated clandestine networks that effectively nullified federal law. The Fugitive Slave Act was the law of the land, passed by Congress, signed by the president, enforced by federal marshals, and they made it meaningless by moving people beyond the First Republic's reach. They understood that when law enforces injustice, law must be ignored. And they proved that organized resistance with clear goals and disciplined networks could beat the system, even when the system had all the formal power. The Secret Six and John Brown. They accepted the final terrible threshold. After every permitted channel closed, after every peaceful option was exhausted, after decades of polite abolitionism and moral suasion and compromise changed nothing, they chose strategic provocation. They accepted that only force could break a system that wouldn't reform itself. They learned what every resistant movement actually learns. Half measures don't work. Either you're willing to do what it takes to break the system, or you're just performing opposition while the system grinds on. And yes, that's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. It is another physical principle of resistance. Inertia, abusive authority is a ball that will roll and it will keep rolling. You sometimes have to step in front of it to stop it. And then the radical Republicans, they got that. They understood that even after winning the war, the battle wasn't over. They seized the moment. They acted with ruthless clarity, impeached a president, forced constitutional amendments through, played constitutional hardball that bordered on illegitimate force, to transform power structures before the window closed. They understood that you don't win by being polite or respecting norms. You win by using every tool available to lock in structural change while you have the power to do it. And they did. That's why you have the 14th Amendment, equal protection, and 15th Amendment, voting rights, because somebody like Charles Sumner decided to stand up and say that Louisiana will not be ceded, and I'm going to show you by speaking for the next 3 days in the longest filibuster in U.S. history up to that point. And then their moment ended, and Reconstruction got rolled back. But that's another pattern. Resistance wins temporarily, then gets interrupted, but that's a whole different discussion. The point is that none of them accepted what was asked. All of them acted outside the comfortable channels that our political culture calls legitimate. They understood something deep and constant. The law is designed for stability, not justice. American law gets shaped by a political culture, both conservative nationalism and liberal nationalism, that promotes the establishment, that serves property and power over people. But our history was made by people who said, screw that. You can have James Madison. We'll change this ourselves. So every time you push back, every time you want to break out of this manufactured fiction of surrender, you are in the best American tradition. And it's a living one.